The first All Hallows Eve wasn't a major success by any means, but it's got a cult following thanks to its great commitment to a creepy Halloween tone and, of course, the star of the show, Art the Clown. 2 years after its release, and a year before Terrifier would really get the ball rolling on Leone's career, All Hallows Eve 2 released with Leone as producer alongside Jesse Bajet. The sequel is also an anthology, but this time around features 9 segments from a flurry of different directors as opposed to the 3 segments all directed by Leone in the first movie. Good evening. My name's Evan and welcome to Rocklin Graves. I like All Hallows Eve quite a bit. It's a fun, gritty, and at times creepy Halloween anthology with a tone that just works for that time of year. It's got issues though, and the thing that arguably holds the whole movie together is this early iteration of Art the Clown. David Howard Thornton may not be the one giving the character the insane life he's got in the Terrifier movies, but Mike Giannelli still did a decent job, and the vision for this antagonist has always been strong. Now, it's not unlikely that you've seen or at the very least heard of All Hallows Eve, but the sequel that came out in 2015 doesn't have anywhere near even the small cult following that the first has. Let's get this out of the way now. Art the Clown is not in this movie. Damien Leone doesn't direct any of the segments, and this is almost entirely unrelated to the last movie and the Terrifier franchise as a whole. The case could be made that since the reason I covered All Hallows Eve was because it had Art the Clown, and I'm including it in the countdown to Terrifier 3, it's not necessary that I dive into its sequel since it's a completely separate thing, but for the sake of completion, I'm doing it anyway since they share a name and Leone is still a producer on it. Alright, with that out of the way, the original idea that Jesse Bajet had for All Hallows Eve was to include Damien Leone's Terrifier short film in an anthology and then bring in other directors to make the other segments, but Leone convinced Bajet to let him do the whole thing himself and include both of his previous short films. He then wrote and directed an additional segment just for the movie, which is ironically the weakest one, and did the wraparounds as well. It's a Damien Leone movie through and through, but it seems like Bajet still wanted to make an anthology with multiple directors involved, so All Hallows Eve 2 is essentially what the original idea for the first movie was. Bajet directed the wraparound segment himself and then sourced 8 other already completed short films from other directors for the additional segments. You can find all of them individually on YouTube since they weren't made specifically for this movie, and I'll have them linked in the description if you're curious about any one of them. Some of them were co-written or co-directed, which is why there are 10 directors but only 8 segments excluding the wraparounds. Yeah, you heard me right. This 90-minute movie is home to 9 segments. Oh, and it's actually 78 minutes long because the credits run for 12 fucking minutes, but to be fair, that's because of how many different crews were involved. All Hallows Eve 2 may be missing the iconic Art the Clown, but is it still worth a watch? Let's take a look. The first movie is no masterpiece, but within a minute of All Hallows Eve 2 starting, your memory of the first movie might start to take on a nice, nostalgic rosiness that'll make you want to go back and just rewatch that instead. Sometimes I see something in a movie or read it in a book, and I wonder how someone can possibly think it's a good thing to include in their story, and All Hallows Eve 2 opens with a woman speaking to ancient spirits through a Ouija board and asking why a guy isn't calling her.
Oh, great spirit of Halloween. Why is Robert not calling me?
Jesse Bajet directed the wraparound segments himself, and they might be the worst part of the movie, save for maybe one baffling short later on. The wraparounds in the first movie weren't incredible, but watching this one and seeing how insanely thin they are this time around makes the ones before feel a lot more substantial. There was very mild story in that one, if you could even call it that, but here, it's kind of nothing. The woman sees a man in a jack-o'-lantern mask and a knife in hand outside her house staring into her window and then sees no issue whatsoever with answering a knock at the door in the middle of the night. There's a VHS tape dropped on the floor and I'll just show you her response to seeing the dude.
Hello?
We're in for a ride. This movie makes a seriously terrible impression, but thankfully the first short film shows some promise for, at the very least, an entertaining Halloween flick. This segment is called Jack Attack, and it's co-directed by Brian Norton and Antonio Padovan. You'll notice an immediate jump in production value and a much more cohesive visual style than the opening scene, and I love the tone choice here. This starts and it just immediately feels like fall. Something that I noticed while watching Jack Attack is that the framing on a few shots looked really bad, and it made me think that it was shot in a different aspect ratio and then cropped in post to add the black bars. And I was right. I found another release of the movie, and it had a different aspect ratio in a lot of cases from the version I was watching on Prime. No idea why, but it felt good to have my guess be spot on. That aside, this is a really great looking short, especially when it's contrasted by how cheap the opening looked. The vibes are there, and on top of that, we've got the classic setup with a babysitter on Halloween.
The pumpkins feel pain.
I really wish she was just like, well, yeah, obviously. And then it just went on showing the kid watching in horror. We get the fastest ever pumpkin carving before the babysitter puts the seeds in the oven, which is an essential part of Halloween night and one of my favorite snacks. I've got to say, I was genuinely shocked when the kid started choking on one of the seeds and his eyes rolled into the back of his head before he fell over.
Okay. Cough.
Why does she barely seem concerned about this?
Your mom is gonna kill me.
Oh, is that your biggest concern here? You know what's a good solution to someone choking? Cutting their throat open with a kitchen knife. That ought to do it. I get she was trying to create another airway, but like, with a kitchen knife? And then she has the great instinct to just start pulling shit out of his throat, which for all she knows is meant to be there, and we get a little glimpse of a pumpkin. You might see where this is going, and yeah, a shit ton of pumpkins have started growing inside of them from the seeds. You season them too heavily, it turns into nutrients. I lost a friend like that a few years ago. I'm starting to think she just solves problems with a kitchen knife. Got a cold? Here, let me slice a hole at the base of your neck so you can bypass the irritated throat when you cough. Trust me, I've done it before. At first I was shocked by what happened, but that very quickly turned into me giggling like a child the longer this went on. There is absolutely zero reason given for why this happened, but it's fucking hilarious and so ridiculously over the top that I can't help but be entertained. Jack Attack ends with the babysitter's boyfriend showing up at the house, and we see the vines from the pumpkins crawling up through the windows. I wish there was some sort of explanation at least hinted at for why this happened, which is a very consistent problem with a lot of the shorts in this movie. I get that they were working with just a couple minutes each, if that, per short, but since you don't have the time to explain things thoroughly, you could at least have some visual storytelling to let the viewers piece together what happened. It is underdeveloped, but it's fun enough and I got a good kick out of it. Right, so the wraparound was weak as shit. The first segment is a big step up, but pretty thin. Where do we go from here? Well, the second segment is called The Last Halloween, and it's directed by Mark Roussel and co-written by Mark Thibodeau. We've got some kids out on Halloween night trick-or-treating at some unsavory spots, and it's pretty clear that something's off. Basically, this is an apocalyptic story where evil spirits are going house to house seeing who's worthy of surviving the night, and when they get turned down at this husband and wife's house, they show their true colors and kill the couple before it's revealed what happens to the houses that don't concede. Some social commentary about the giving nature of people, perhaps? It's not terrible, but as with a lot of the shorts in this movie, when it ended, I was kind of left with a feeling of, that's it? Granted, this one's a hell of a lot more compelling than some of what's left to come, and it's nice to see some solid direction coming through. It starts to get pretty clear around this point that making a movie that's only really, it's 78 minutes long, and splitting that up into 9 different stories that are completely separate from one another with 0 tie-ins results in some really sluggish pacing. There's really only one short film that's long enough to let you get invested in it and give some impact, but those tight time constraints with the others can work for some stories like Jack Attack. With something with such a tight time restriction, you kind of have to keep your concepts super simple, and I feel like this one was trying to do a bit too much with the amount of time it had to tell its story. The third short is called The Offering. It's written by Michael Kohler and directed by Ryan Patch, and it's at this point that I really realized that this movie is a victim of its own structure. Something like Trick or Treat has 5 stories, which allows them to breathe more, but the other thing that works so well about Trick or Treat is that those stories are all woven together to create a vignette of this mysterious Halloween night. We have things in some stories that come back around in others, and it all adds up to this very cohesive and satisfying movie with a consistent vision, but when you've got completely different filmmakers working on completely isolated stories, it is hard to stay engaged. I hit that point about 20 minutes into All Hallows Eve 2. The short itself is decent, showing a father and son making an offering to some unknown beast out in the forest, but the meat they needed was forgotten at home, so the father locks his son out of the car and he gets dragged off as a replacement. Cool concept, but the story kind of lost any impact it would have had when I realized that in order to forget the meat, it couldn't have been a very substantial amount, so One of them could have just cut off a hand or something like that and been done with it. Thankfully, it's still shot well and has a cool setup, but there's not really much to say about it. The performances are quite good here. I liked them, especially the father's face when he is conflicted with what he's doing. Now, the fourth short is where I started to regain some faith that we could have some real bangers mixed in here. It's directed by Jay Holbin and co-written by Christopher Probst. Titled Descent, nice try. This one finds a woman going to a friend's house only to find her murdered on the bed. She quickly hides in the closet and sees the killer, and the short subverts expectations by having her escape and then skipping 6 weeks later. I always like that kind of toying with expectations, and I think especially in a short film, that kind of thing is really important to do. As soon as she got on an elevator on her way home after work, I knew where it was going and I was getting really excited. The man she saw that night steps into the elevator, and after the nice guy passenger gets out, the woman is left with the killer in an elevator that breaks down. This is genuinely one of my favorite setups for a short story that I've ever seen, largely because it's the perfect format for a shorter story. Some things make more sense as feature films, which is why they're developed that way, but some stories work much better when left to just a few minutes. Like Night Swim. This is a great formula for a short story, and I was fully on board with her increasing paranoia. It's fantastic. There are so many cool directions to take this, and I actually giggled a little bit when her phone rang, and you can see him recognize the ringtone from that night. I was so on board. I was so into it. And it's a shame that I found the way it unfolds super disappointing. After a while of sitting in this great idea, the woman decides to kill the man with a pen, and once she gets out, it's revealed that this wasn't the guy who committed the murder after all. It's just another bald guy, and it was her trauma that tricked her brain into thinking it was the same dude. I get the idea, but I found this really deflating and kind of a cheap way to end the story. To have this great concept, and then those fantastic details of like him recognizing her ringtone, and having him whistle like the guy in the opening did, and then to just throw all of that away, it feels like a waste of a fantastic setup. The trauma angle is interesting, but doing it by having them locked in the elevator together seems like a setup for a completely different story. It's not terrible. In fact, I'd say it's one of the better shorts because it feels like a story that was meant for this formatting. I just felt like this was not the right direction to take the story after the way that they set it up. There was so much potential here, and it felt like none of it was fully realized. Either way, I did get a kick out of it, and it reignited my hope that the movie would have some good offerings, but it seems cruel that they directly follow that up with what is, without a doubt, the worst segment in the entire movie, maybe tied with the lame wraparound that you probably forgot was a thing at this point. So this one's called Masochist. It's written and directed by James and John Kondelik. They're a duo filmmakers. They're brothers. Cool that they're doing that. It shows a group of young boys at a carnival game where you choose something to throw at someone on a target, and the more they bleed, the better you do. Well, it turns out the guy on the board is one of the kids' abusive father, so he goes all out with a chainsaw as revenge, and then we see someone else on the board after. That's it. Maybe this was some sort of cathartic story for some, but it felt like a complete waste of the 3-ish minutes it runs for. Okay, we're getting there. Only 3 more segments to go, and thankfully, the one that follows that ridiculous short is probably the best in the whole movie, but it's also the one that runs for the longest, so it's given a lot more time to develop. Written and directed by Elias Benavides, it tells the story of a young boy who's grieving the loss of his father. He's convinced there are monsters in his room, and in a lot of ways, this is your standard the parent doesn't believe the kid until it's too late, but what makes this work is the really touching relationship between the two. You can tell that the mother is, of course, also having a hard time, and she'll catch herself when she gets frustrated with the boy and knows how confusing this must be for him. It's a slower paced story, but I just really enjoyed the dynamic between these two. I wasn't expecting anything in All Hallows Eve 2 to lean this much into an emotional and thoughtful story, and the ending scene where the mother decides she'll play along with the boy's game so he can get it out of his system and tells him he's finally beaten the monster was really great. Left me with a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling, and oh yeah, this is a horror movie. Right. Yeah, I'd say this is the best segment in the movie, and it's punctuated by a reaction from this young actor that really did hit me right in the feels after watching what led up to this moment. There is a lot to this short, with the two of them just trying to find a way to deal with the loss of father and husband. Definitely go give this one a watch. The next segment is barely worth talking about. It's called Mr. Tricker's Treat. It's written and directed by Mike Kochanski and co-written by Mark Byers, and it's just a dude who uses real people for Halloween decorations. There's this incredibly annoying, incredibly stupid woman who shows up and he kills her. That's it. It just feels mean-spirited with the cages without having any actual payoff. It's lame. All right. Final segment before we get back to the absolutely pointless wraparounds. Now, I've got no issues watching movies with subtitles, but it is a strange decision to have an anthology entirely in one language and then change it for the final segment. Oh well, thankfully it's not a total piece of shit, but it's still nothing all that memorable. This one's called Alexia. It's written and directed by Andres Borgi. We see a young man grieving the death of a past girlfriend while he browses Facebook on his mint gaming setup. He tries moving on by unfriending her, which throws his computer into a loop that looks like those fake viruses to use to scare people who don't know shit about how viruses actually work. The spooky bitch starts messaging him with some really fucked up images that actually raised up the hair on the back of my neck a bit, thinking about how I'd react if I saw that. Online and like computer horror stuff oddly scares me a fair bit. Maybe it's because I grew up with this stuff. I'll still never forget seeing The Den for the first time. Good God. It's been a minute since I've seen that. I think I might be due a rewatch. He shuts off his computer and a dead-looking hand reaches around, but nothing else really happens until the dude's current girlfriend shows up and finds some creepy pictures of herself on his computer that's somehow still running. Spooky, spooky, but hey, fantastic face here to close things off. This is what a jealous relationship will do to you. This one did get me a bit with some of the imagery on the PC, and it's a decent enough short, especially compared to what's about to come with the final wraparound segment. This is so stupid, and it is tied with Masochist for the worst segment in the movie. Back to this fucking moron who sees the exact frame of the dude from the start standing outside of her window and still doesn't seem all that concerned about it. She tries taking the tape out and the exact same thing that happened at the end of the first movie happens again, but way less cool this time because they didn't bother showing the TV, so the effect loses any impact, and of course, it's just this lame jack-o'-mask dude with absolutely zero character. Then he's behind her and slits her throat. The end. Roll credits. Jesus Christ almighty, a lot of that movie felt like a complete and utter waste of time. I'm very glad that Leone took control of the first movie, because if this is the kind of thing that Jesse Bajan had in mind originally, It's weird though, because there are some decent segments and there's one really good segment in there, but the vast majority of this movie feels like half-baked ideas thrown together to try and stretch this thing out to 78 minutes so they could call it a feature film. It feels both empty and bloated at the same time. At its peaks, it's got some great ideas and some really good execution, but at its worst, it's fucking awful. I had some hope early on with Jack Attack that it would be something that I could revisit around Halloween, but honestly, I have no plans of watching this again, at least not anytime soon. All Hallows Eve, again, was not a masterpiece by any means, but it had a distinct tone and style that made it feel more cohesive. The wraparound segments had more purpose and character to them, and of course, has the huge leg up by having Art the Clown as its antagonist. All Hallows Eve 2 doesn't have much of anything that would make me recommend it, especially since you can just go on YouTube and watch the good segments on their own. Well, there we have it. I'm putting a little pause on things before we dive into Terrifier, and also, we're not doing any Omen reviews through February. I'm saving that for March when we'll get back into that. Quiet Place also got delayed, so I've had to reschedule a bunch of things, but that's opened up some video opportunities for me that I'm very excited for this month, and then we'll be getting back into the franchises. We will be doing the 2009 remake of My Bloody Valentine for its 15th anniversary. I adore the original. The remake? We'll get to that on Valentine's Day. Until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.